Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Mixed opinions from Ferrari as to their chances in the second half of the season. Fred Vasseur simultaneously says they're closer than ever to beating McLaren, but equally admits that McLaren are simply way too good to be beaten in equal circumstances. Some other interesting rumours as to what's happening with Hamilton behind the scenes of that team, and some other interesting updates on the day elsewhere as well. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. Just quickly, starting with the driver market. Perez, Bottas, they're going to Cadillac. Otmar says he definitely has something to offer. Checo would be a good addition, of course. Otmar, former top guy at Alpine. There were questions whether Perez would go to Alpine, but it seems that Perez and Bottas both believe the Cadillac opportunity is kind of more exciting. And Mario Andretti, of course, advisor to Cadillac. It's kind of interesting. We talked the other day about the potential Caterham Formula 1 team back on the grid. That feels very unlikely to me, because as we know, Andretti didn't get an entry. They did, and they're still kind of involved, like their parent company is involved in the ownership and the running of the Cadillac General Motors Formula 1 team, but it wasn't as Andretti. That was actually an issue for Formula 1. They wanted Cadillac. They wanted General Motors. They wanted that like really big kind of household name, I guess, as it were. And therefore, I imagine a similar thing would occur for other potential entries. I don't know if Caterham have the pull like that, but intrigued your thoughts in the comments. Now, Mario Andretti says, just believe what we communicate. He refuses to deny anything, but I think we can probably guess what's happening there. There was another interesting rumour around Colton Herta. This is not Colton Herta, that is Willpower. This is Colton Herta. Now, we thought that he might get a drive at AlphaTauri, as it was a little while ago, when the whole Nick De Vries thing was happening, Daniel Ricciardo. They were looking at Colton Herta, and at the time, he was a pretty promising, younger American driver with, pace, pretty exciting prospect, but he was racing in IndyCar, so he wasn't getting the points. Now, I still think that IndyCar gets heavily undervalued by the FIA. At the end of the day, it's not an FIA championship, so they are not considering maybe in the same light, and I think it's a very competitive championship IndyCar, and it's an enjoyable watch when there's no Formula 1 on, and even if there is, sometimes it's still great fun. But they don't give the drivers many points for their license, right? And as a result, Herta, a couple of years ago, wasn't able to get the super license exemption that he wanted, or that, Red Bull wanted to maybe get him onto the team, and as a result, he wasn't in the sport. Now, it's possible to get those points if you do some free practice sessions and all this, but the FIA have not changed their approach on the requirements for the super license, apart from the fact that you no longer have to be 18, as we saw recently with some of those exemptions. But as a result, Herta, there was a rumour, is considering coming and driving in Formula 2, which he could do. He certainly wouldn't be the youngest driver in F2, and that would give him the points, effectively. That would be the idea. It's interesting. He responded to this. The article basically says, I'm not going to click on it because here it goes. I've heard those rumours too. That's all it is right now. It's rumours. So he didn't exactly deny it. But yeah, there are some rumours that Colton Herta might look to drive in F2 so we can get the super license points to potentially come into F1. It might be too little too late at this point. The ship may have sailed. But currently Herta is in a tough spot in IndyCar and is kind of drifting only backwards. So it's a possibility that he could consider that. But whether the F1, as I say, ship has sailed, it seems kind of likely to me. The other big news around 2026 is on these brakes. So we've talked the last few days, I hope you guys have found it interesting anyway, about the 2026 regulations, what it's going to look like, what the teams are saying about it, and some of the design choices that they're coming up with. Now, we know that McLaren, their brakes are a key topic of conversation this year. How they're managing the rear brake temperatures, the ducts, all that type of stuff to keep the core temperature of the rear tyres under control. It's a major reason why this picture is a picture with the two McLarens having a rather good time. Now, the 2026 braking systems are expected to be quite dramatically different. And what's very interesting is that the brake manufacturers are saying that a lot of teams are giving them very different things to build. And that's very interesting, right? Because typically the manufacturers expect a team to say, okay, hey Brembo, hey Carbon Industries, we want you to build this or to build that. And they will be different, but maybe not massively different. But what Andrea Algeri here says from Brembo, he's their customer manager, that they are coming up with some very different ideas right now. In the rear axle, we have seen extreme choices in the sense of disc dimension. They are very small compared to the current ones in terms of diameter, but also in thickness. So primarily, the teams are requesting far smaller rear brakes, and I guess the question is to why. So it means that they believe that on the rear axle, they are basically not braking at all, or only in a very few cases. So this is very interesting with respect to McLaren, because currently they have dominance, at least in part because of how they're managing the temperature of the rear brakes. But the theory goes that next year we might not need rear brakes. And that seems outrageous to say, and it is, there will be rear brakes. But the reasons for it are kind of specific here. What we're expecting is that the brakes will not be used in some corners because the braking is done with other systems. And we'll explain what that is in a second. Then on the other side, there will be some corners though where they are very, very stressed. So you'll have to be prepared to face this wide range. And Brembo says that there's uncertainty between the design briefs among the teams. We have seen different approaches. It's mainly on the rear because the rear axle design depends on how they design the power unit, the energy recovery, and their strategy and so on. So we are a bit blind, which sounds good, doesn't it? But the reason why they have some of these numbers is not clear to us. We have seen some outliers that will be very clever solutions if they are right. I mean, that's fascinating. That some teams are coming up with brake ideas that Brembo are saying, damn, if that works, that's impressive, right? Otherwise, they will have to redo the braking system after a few tests or a few races. So, yeah, fascinating. Things could go very well, or they could go dramatically wrong. They also go on to describe the reason why they're doing this. So the main issue is how you manage the energy. If someone were able to guess it right away, I think they would win the first 4 to 5 races. Right now, all teams are delaying their choices because there are so many unknowns. The tyres are being entirely new, the aero, the tyres, the management. At the rear, the contribution of regenerative braking will be higher than before. So the point is that because the amount of energy deployment is much larger, the electrical component of the engine is much bigger, they need to regenerate that very aggressively indeed. So a lot of the braking will be done through regenerative braking for the engine rather than necessarily with the brakes themselves. So that's the idea anyway, that they can use regenerative braking through the electrical component to actually help slow the car down quite dramatically. So they're going to need smaller rear brakes. This introduces though another problem, because on some tracks and some curves you could easily brake only with the regeneration of the hybrid, well, without heating up the disc brakes at all. But at the next turn you may have a problem, let's say. So yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be really, really interesting, right? You're going to have teams in certain corners where they're not braking at all because they can simply just effectively coast and the car will lurch and slow down dramatically. Engine braking, but doing so on a more extreme level for the hybrid. But then some corners you might really need the brakes. You will really need the brakes, but they're going to be small and they might not be in the right temperature window because you've not used them in the corner before. So yeah, I don't know. It really opens the door for a quite fascinating development, I would say, this season. Who's getting it right though? I think that's another good question. You've got the Brembo guys. Now, Mercedes don't work with Brembo, they work with Carbon Industry. So worthy to note here that Ferrari use Brembo, quite a few teams use Brembo. But he, when he said that we have seen some outliers that will be very clever solutions if they are right, I think that's a pretty fascinating assessment. What are McLaren cooking? That's a good question. They do use Brembo brake suppliers. I think Brembo give at least something to basically every team. Mercedes, I think, use their discs at Carbon Industries, but maybe their calipers are from Brembo. It gets a little bit confusing, really. So Brembo, the point is they may have insights towards every team, so it may not be that these clever solutions are just from certain teams that they supply, primarily. But yeah, who really knows? Obviously, there's so much secrecy around this sport at the best of times. Now, the Zandvoort Grand Prix is next weekend. McLaren are expected to be in a rather good spot, and frankly their car has been so good around Zandvoort last year that we are expecting them to effectively do what they did in Hungary again. It would be frankly a big surprise if that doesn't happen. Can Mercedes get anywhere close like they did a couple of years ago? Maybe. Can Ferrari get anywhere close? That is a very good question. They really, at this point, Ferrari are just trying to win Monza. That is the goal, I think. They're trying to win a race. Hamilton's trying to get a podium. and they would love to win Monza, as of course they famously did last year and back in 2019. So that's what they're really working towards right now. I'm sure that they've got some sort of special Monza wing, because that's just what they tend to do. But is it going to be enough? We know that the car has been fundamentally flawed since birth, and the China Grand Prix was the key moment really to show, okay, this car does not work in the way that we want it to, because if we run it too low, it can deliver performance. For example, in the sprint, they can run the car very low because they don't have to worry about the plank wear as much, because they've not got 70 laps, they've only got a third of that. And therefore they won the China sprint. Whereas in the race, they have to be a bit more careful, they raise the car by a few millimeters, or they have to max out the pressure of the tyres to help lift the car up, as we think they did to Charles Leclerc back in Hungary. The performance disappears, the car doesn't work well when the rear ride height isn't where they think it could be. And it's been an absolute shambles. It destroys their tyre degradation as well. And yeah, fundamentally, the SF25 has been one of the more flawed Ferrari cars, which in some respects shouldn't be a massive surprise. And we'll see this article here in a second, just because they changed 99% of it, right? If there was any team at the top end anyway that were likely to mess it up this year, Ferrari were the most likely. Now, they're still sticking by Fred Vasseur, and they've given him an extension on his contract, but he's got interesting opinions on what their chances really are between now and the end of the season. So Vasseur says a few things. Fundamentally, it's mega difficult to predict because one day is not necessarily representative of the next weekend's, but I would say the last two, we are back into the pace in Spa and Hungary. We're back into the pace, we're quite consistent on the tyres, we're able to manage the pace, and if we're back in quali, it means that we can fight with them. Of course, Leclerc put in the mega pole lap in Hungary, but the consistency in qualifying from, I mean, obviously Hamilton was out in Q2 that time, but it's not like Leclerc was miles ahead of him. It just felt like when the winds changed in that final Q3 session in Hungary, the Ferrari just coped much better with those conditions than the McLarens did. Leclerc manages a great lap and sticks it on pole, but, you know, he says we've got a chance to fight with them. He reckons, I think there was another discussion here, that in Spa, for example, they weren't far off the pace. If you look at in Spa, we were 2/10 off in the race. This weekend, we did the pole position. We were able to stay in front for 40 laps, he says. Obviously, lots of frustration, but, you know, he thinks they're maybe closer than they have been before, but he does say that the advantage they had in Hungary is always there. It doesn't matter. In quali, you're a bit better, but it was marginal. They are performing in every single condition. We are a bit more inconsistent during the weekends. It's clear they're a bit more performant than us. So, yeah, in one sentence, he's like, well, we're closer than ever. We've maybe got a chance in the second half of the season. And to be fair, they better be, because they brought a raft of upgrades to that Ferrari, some of which have worked, some of which haven't really seemingly done all that much. But on the same tone, it's like, well, it's not like there are tracks where McLaren have weaknesses, really. We saw it in, I mean, Canada, right? Montreal. They weren't great that weekend. And we know that that track is, I mean, it's basically one corner tyre, right? It's a left-right chicane. And Mercedes really nailed it that weekend, and even with their new rear suspension, which they then got rid of because they realised it was problematic elsewhere on more traditional circuits. You know, Montreal's a great track, don't get me wrong. I was at that Grand Prix, it was fantastic to be there. But it is very unique in the sense that it doesn't really have all that many different types of corner profiles. That did expose McLaren a bit. Like, it's almost like McLaren are so consistent across all sorts of different domains that across one very specific type of situation, they might not necessarily be able to set their car up the best. Whereas across basically all other tracks, where there is some compromise in play, then they're just the best by a margin. So I think that's Ferrari's concern. And the other thing is that when it rains, the McLaren just seems to get even better and the Ferrari gets worse. So it's not like, oh, if it rains, maybe it opens the door to Ferrari. If anything, it could be the other way around. The other discussion was around Hamilton and what's going on there right now. There were a couple of interesting comments from Juan Pablo Montoya, who, as we know, always has some interesting opinions. But he said that Hamilton's been driving a certain way for many years and it works. The problem is that many engineers are saying, no, this car needs to be driven differently. This car needs something else. Now, you guys might remember the other day, we saw some comments from Arturo Mazzario, former Ferrari driver, who said that on his sources, 90% of Ferrari employees never wanted Hamilton to join, which I said at the time sounded pretty, like, outrageous in terms of given what we think we know about Ferrari. But, you know, you never really know. I mean, you'd imagine at least his Hamilton side of the to be happy about it, and maybe 90% is a heavy figure, but I will say that it's not like it's only Mazzario talking about this. Like, it's Montoya here kind of implies a similar thing, and he says Ferrari just want Hamilton for his name. And he goes on to say at the end of this, Montoya interpreted Hamilton's comments. Obviously, after Hungary, he was very critical of himself. He was like, oh, you should just replace me then. And a few races before then, Hamilton was saying that there's things going on in the backgrounds that I can't describe, but imply why things are a struggle. And Montoya says, my point of view is what he is saying is that Ferrari are not really paying attention to him and they just want him for his name, which is an interesting read on it, isn't it, really? Look, it's obviously part of this move, Ferrari, Hamilton. It's a big PR move. It's a big PR win. You bring in the greatest, successful driver to the most successful team. It works well for both parties on paper. But if the team, if the actual, let's say, men on the ground aren't fully on board with it, or whether there's some sort of disagreement internally as to whether this was the right move or not, which obviously Mazzario implied there was the other day, and now Montoya says that Hamilton's maybe picking up on this and is looking at his team and saying, damn guys, do you really want me here? Or am I just here because it looks good on the timesheets or whatever? And when we do the social media post, maybe there's something to that. I don't know. But definitely intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Some of these OG drivers always have some interesting opinions, to say the least. And just one final thing, speaking of OG drivers, thought this might be a little heartwarming in many respects. Rubens Barrichello is a champion of the NASCAR Brazil Series. I think he's 53 now. But 15 years after leaving Formula One, he's been entering a few championships. He did a bit in Le Mans, a bit in IndyCar, just a couple of times. But he still races from time to time. And he entered this series, NASCAR Brazil, and he won it quite substantially. So thought that was really cool. Like, one of the best Brazilian drivers ever. There is no doubt about that. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.